Hi guys, my name's Seb Tudor. I'm the man on the Silver Mountain, and welcome back. Now, I've had a lot of you send me this TED talk by is it Catherine Raworth or something like that, who did a talk on donut economics, and this isn't a particularly new idea. All told, it's just a arguably better way of visualizing it. And so I wanted to kind of go into talking about it and discussing it because I feel like as much as did a good job of kind of highlighting the way that it looks, giving people a good look at actually what the situation is to one extent or another. Obviously, I think it was only like a 10-minute TED talk, and there's more to it, including more limitations than what she listed. And again, I'll point this out. My insight in this is some of my own reading into things like economic theory at large, but mostly based off my experience from working in large corporations, large businesses, running my own business, and being a coach. So gap analysis and kind of finding the weak points, pulling things to pieces, appraising them, and finding a way forward is very much kind of my bread and butter. And so as a result, I kind of wanted to touch in on why we're in the situation where economic growth, is seen as the be-all, end-all. And it's something that's left over from the attitudes that kicked off the Industrial Revolution, where prior to the Industrial Revolution, everyone was limited by their direct resources, how much land they had, how many animals they could farm, how much they could kind of generate in terms of crops or in terms of product based on time that it would take for them to make something or sow something or otherwise kind of develop a product of some description. But of course, with the Industrial Revolution, especially things like smelting, the creation of iron, the creation of sewing machines and looms that were far more mechanized and able to pump out far more. When I was doing history in school, one of the things that we spent arguably possibly a bit too long on was in regards to the Industrial Revolution. You had things like the spinning jenny being created that were allowed textile production to just expand hugely just because it was so much faster to generate kind of huge amounts of cloth or huge amounts of other materials than it was before that. And so as a result, though, where back then it was always a case of, or before the Industrial Revolution, it was a case of looking at the situation and going, well, if I've got more, then I win. If I grow, if I expand, if I take over other people's stuff, then I'm good and they're not. And it means I end out on top. And that kind of got carried across into the Industrial Revolution, and you had an awful lot of greed, an awful lot of development, people being used in a lot of horrible, absolutely horrific ways. But then, obviously, we've been over a century since the Industrial Revolution now. It's been a long time. And yet we're still clinging to certain elements of that mindset. For instance, in a lot of places in the Western world, as is cited by people like Ken Robinson, or Sir Ken Robinson, I guess, we are still very much focused on the industrial model of education, where it's not a case of people developing their skills and expanding themselves into the best space for them and specializing in the things that they need, as well as picking up the basics of other things. It's a case of you need to jump through these hoops. You don't necessarily have to demonstrate that you can apply the knowledge that you've learned or the things that you've done You just need to be able to have someone look at a piece of paper and tick the boxes after you've written down something that you learned wrote. And so, that's a problem that we're still facing that's much more obvious. But also, even up until the 1970s, 1980s, where computers and further automation, greater expansion were all becoming more prevalent, where we were going from more of the beginning or the endings of the Industrial Revolution into a kind of either second Industrial Revolution or arguably a digital revolution. The changes there that took place and so on still held that idea of growth, of making sure that you had more than the other person. And now that we're into the kind of 2000s here, it's become a bit of an issue because we're no longer able to sustain those old views, simply because there's just nowhere else for us to grow, and the more that we grow, the more damage we do overall. There's no plateauing and sustainability of a high level. There's this up and down, this erratic, only somewhat predictable mess that we have made for ourselves, because in chasing growth outside of a system that already may very well have hit the point where it should have plateaued, that development and that chasing of that without concern for the rest of the system is causing problems. And so is it important, for instance, when we look at say the UK being, dropping to the lowest growing country in Europe? Yes, that's important. Why? Because we have already developed a population used to a certain amount of growth, a certain amount of development in terms of wealth and so on, which we are no longer seeing. And as a result, it becomes, the population becomes unsustainable. The way of life that we have becomes unsustainable. And so is that a major concern? Yes, that drop off in growth is hugely concerning. But then looking at the rest of the system and the rest of the goings on, is growth the be all end all? No, because the more we grow, the more we claim, the more we use up, the less we end up having in the long run. We are trying to develop this ongoing growing system in at a point where we're actually now running into going from being a zero sum before the Industrial Revolution to a positive sum post-revolution, to now becoming more of a zero sum again as the world begins to shrink. And as a result, we're, just because we haven't maintained it being positive sum, we're chewing up and churning up a lot of things that we don't need to. Now, going back to the Doughnut economics thing, which, by the way, I'll leave a link to the video, to the TED Talk down in the description. Going back to the Doughnut economics idea, you've got the kind of upper limits where we're either producing too much, doing too much damage, things like climate change, and how we're affecting that. We've got the green zone in the middle where we would be perfect, that's our Goldilocks zone. And then we've got the other areas where we're not doing enough. For instance, in regards to everyone having healthcare, everyone having the food and the resources and things that they need. Now, why are we in that situation where we're actually going into those red zones, either overproducing on negative factors or underproducing to cause negative factors or to support them long term? Simply put, because we're still looking at things in a very greedy way. We're still looking at it. The mindset of a lot of people has not changed from zero sum to positive sum to worries of a zero sum. They've just always assumed that it's this zero sum game where nothing is really being added and it's all just there for claiming. And there have been people who have talked about universal basic income, how that monetary stimulus We've seen how that can work with how the Obama administration's stimulus packages actually picked up their economy quite successfully post-recession. We've seen how lots of places, lots of people complain about things like taxes and international aid. Why? Well, because again, it's that zero-sum mindset whilst we're in a positive-sum world at the moment, where they're concerned about losing assets when those assets that they are having to present, give up, whatever, they're not actually seeing a negative impact of it. You provide taxes to a government, and could they be better used? Probably in many instances, but they still go towards things like, at least in the UK, healthcare, education, maintenance of infrastructure, maintenance of kind of the general world in which we live, roads, whatever else, which I suppose falls under an infrastructure as well in a way. But it's still a case of, though, that money then gets funneled through to the benefit of either others like you or yourself, even if it's in some small way. But then again, you're one small person in again, if I'm looking at the UK, kind of 64.1 million people, there are very few people, considering the modal income, the most frequent income, the largest bracket for income in the UK is between £15,000 and £17,000 a year. It's one of those situations where, yeah, fine, you might want to keep hold of your money, but then again, you're not actually comparatively presenting as much. And in addition to that, you're probably also being in the lower end of the kind of income brackets for the population here. You're probably also seeing more benefit from the services, NHS, state-run schools, all of those kind of things. You're more likely to be taking full advantage of those things rather than someone who is paying substantially more, substantially higher percentage in terms of tax, but then they are also probably not using as many of those services. They're sending their children to private schools. They're going and taking on private healthcare. And so on and so forth. There are those various bits and pieces. Again, are there ways that the money could be used better? Of course, but that's where we need to stop looking at personality in politics and start looking at policy more so, to get the things that we want more rather than just who we like. But again, that's a slightly different situation, but it is one that impacts this. So then, though, what's the way to approach other things, though? International aid, for instance, which again is very much a case of people wanting to keep their money for their country rather than let it go elsewhere. Well, simply put, international aid helps everybody. It doesn't matter who you are or where you are. The more countries developing, the more stuff, the more likely you're going to see a benefit from it. In fact, Kurzgesagt did a great video on this, which I'll also link down below, on egoistic altruism, where they go through this. And it's all of this stuff is not new. There have been many people who have gone through all of this stuff, talked about this stuff time and time again, and yet still nothing has changed. And so when I had two of you guys link the TED Talk that I've linked down below to me, I've had a collection of other people sharing it, and of course it's popped up on my my YouTube homepage and subscriptions feed, and it's a case of going, yeah, but none of this is a new idea, none of it is like, it all makes sense, it's all perfectly reasonable. If you look at the way that it functions at the moment, the more people who are in that green zone that is described in that model, then the better off the world is, and the way to support that is from the inside. You're looking at supporting people. From the outside, you're looking at trying to limit them, and it makes sense. It's things that we've been striving to achieve in certain areas for a long time now. But what's the thing that stopped us from doing it? Well, it's the people. It's not the fact that there aren't the mechanics in place to do it, or that it would take too much time or too much money. Some of these things would take very little money, relatively speaking. And yet, in fact, some of these would cost absolutely no money just to get signed off, listed, and kind of put into law in certain instances. And in fact, it might drive up the amount of money that you could earn from it to then reallocate towards other projects that would be further more beneficial overall to the larger number of people. And now there are two issues that we see with this. One, we've got the old mindset, which again, from me working in companies, it's always there's talk about market share, there's talk about making sure that you beat out the competition, that you deal with the other plans that other companies may have, so make sure that you can override them, that you can kind of get your way so that you can take more customers and all that kind of thing, even if it would actually be potentially more advantageous to work with those other people on something, or develop more of a communication with that other company or other partner within the industry, to share best practice, to develop other things, because there are certain areas where that just doesn't happen. Quite frankly, it's one of the biggest problems that I had when working in those corporate spaces, because it's a case of, if they're not going to share best practice, then that means that it's not the people at the top that suffer. It's not even necessarily the customers that suffer. More often than not, rather, it's the staff that suffer most from a lack of training in best practice, from a management team that is aware of what they either should be doing, can be doing, or shouldn't be doing. And so as a result, with that focus, that sole focus on having more than everybody else, being the leader in their industry, being the one with the largest market share and whatever else, it's something that then leads to, firstly, the staff suffering, and then secondly, after a little while, after things develop in that way, that's when you see customers suffering. One of the industries that stands out to me most, where you see this at the moment, because it's a fairly new industry, is streaming services, where you go on to TV and potentially you have a program that's being shown on several different TV packages, or a channel that's being shown on several different TV packages, and then you just go for whoever it is that you prefer the package from. If one package comes with a large amount of like a very high speed internet connection, and that's also what you're looking for, so you wanted that channel, you want this thing, and you want that the internet connection, and you'll go for that one. But if you don't really want an internet connection but you still want that show, then you just go for a TV package, and so it's something that works there. But then you look at streaming services and it's all exclusives, or we've got the rights from this and so we're the only place that show it, so if you want to buy into our subscription service, then that might be the only thing you're getting from us, but you're going to be paying the same price as you would for anything else. It's not a case of which one's services do I provide, which one caters more to what I want most. It's a case of, well, if I want to watch any of these things, if I want any of this type of entertainment, then I need to subscribe to each one of these different things. And as a result, it's the case of, again, the customers suffer most when it really comes down to it, because they're having to expend potentially for three things that if they were able to get in either an older format or otherwise, then potentially they would kind of get more for their money. And yet it's now a format that's been watered down and dying out from the old guard. The old way that things were being developed is being shifted to the way that makes more money. And so as a result, things like streaming services, subscription services, much more limited services with far more in the way of paywalls involved, becomes more of a thing. And as a result, it becomes kind of a bigger issue overall. And then of course you've got the next people up who are trying to work to support those customers. They're not earning huge amounts of money, but they're there to to schedule things, work with things, and yet it's always now becoming a struggle between who's doing what and how they're doing it. When if you look at it the other way, where if you had these subscription services and they don't need to share their original shows, but everything else is shared on license, in which case the people who own those licenses earn more money from the places that are wanting to take on their shows or whatever else, and then each place has more of an incentive to develop a better experience for their customers, and then they might break the market into different chunks and different separations rather than having someone subscribe to all of them. But then there would be more of a reason to potentially charge more. You would potentially, if you had everything plus your original content plus a better platform with a more user-friendly kind of makeup to it, then potentially you take more of the market share. But it's there's a lot of fear and a lot of greed and a lot of that old mindset in there that's stuck. And then the other problem is that we've still got a huge amount of greedy people, all those people at the top who are doing perfectly well for themselves, who don't want to share with anybody else in any way, shape or form as best they're able. Many of our politicians are sat in that space. Many of the people in big business are sat in that space. There are very few politicians at the very top of the chain who aren't in that space, especially within, at the very least in this country, the two major parties. It's definitely not in the States in their two major parties. And so it's a big problem there, because the way that that would best benefit more people, including those people at the top, would be the current top, I should say, would again be that egoistic altruism, where the more people that can afford a thing, the more people that want to buy into a thing, the more people that can support a thing, the more likely that thing is to occur, to develop, to become more worth having. One thing that we have a huge problem with at the moment is things like world hunger, and things like mortality rates in third world countries and things like that. Mortality rates within our own countries from things that are either completely preventable or completely curable, but access to treatments is difficult, or in regards to things like cancer, like various forms of AIDS and HIV, that are either difficult to manage, difficult to handle, incurable, terminal. We've got all of these various problems that we are working to solve, but imagine if at the moment we've only got a very small number of people that can afford to put money towards the solutions to those problems, to energy problems, to food production problems, to mortality problems and healthcare. But obviously, the more enrichment there is, the more stimulus there is for other people to allow greater growth and development, then the people at the top who may be suffering from cancer, who may be suffering from issues as a result of the impact of our current means of producing energy. That would be the biggest issue, where at the moment we need to see that greater development in those various areas, and yet at the moment there are only a very small number of people who can afford to do so. The more people that can afford to do so, the more likely those things are to get picked up, developed, grown, solutions found, and so on and so forth. And yet it's that greed, it's that part of people that is left over from us being animals, left over from us from before a time when we had the means by which to produce more, to move beyond human and kind of basic survival constraints. We've still got that greed sat there, and it's at times an important emotion. It's an important thing to have in our heads. There is a reason why it is there as part of our survival mechanisms. But it's not something, again, it's something to be aware of and taken into account and controlled, rather than something that we just act on impulse with. And so, yes, the visualization of the donut economics and the other ways that things have been worked around, yeah, not got a problem with that. All makes sense. All good ideas. All things that, in my opinion, should be actioned, can be actioned in one way or another. But the biggest problems aren't the mechanics of it. It's not even how big the problem is. It's the fact that there are just selfish people with a very outdated mindset that are still sat in the way. And trying to convince those people is going to be difficult. Trying to work with those people is basically going to be impossible in various ways. And so as a result, yes, could donut economics be the big new thing? I mean, it's not a new thing. The way of visualizing it might be, but it's not a big thing in and of itself. You know, it's an idea that's been around for a long time in one way or another. It's a thing that has been acknowledged and that many of us have been aware of for quite some time. Be it through online videos, be it through reading into books like, from what I recall, Freakonomics has, which if you haven't read that, read it. Same with Blink, actually, also another good book, slightly different on a different subject, but both great books worth reading to gain insight into these kind of areas. But it's a case of with these situations, it's human greed, and it's the limited thinking of a lot of people who are currently in control that causes the problem. Again, looking at this, I could looking at the donut economics idea and the problems and the things that are moving around with it, we can look directly to the fact that at the very least in I can't remember if it was in the UK or the US. I read a report the other day whereby flat rental costs have jumped up by 20%, and yet the average income just hasn't, not to anywhere near the same extent to allow people to live and support themselves. And so all those young people who already don't have any hope of buying a home because of their background, because of the assets that they have available to them, the jobs that they're stuck in, their level of education, whatever it may be, health even potentially. So even though they may not be able to afford a home, or there may not be a home even available for them in some instances, now it's also a case of, as much as we are the generation that rents, there may not even be a way for those people to rent either. Which are then what are the solutions to that problem? Well, at the moment, it's a case of either there is no solution to that problem, and that person may very well go into have to jump through all manner of hoops through the welfare state, even if they would otherwise have a decent amount of money by older standards or compared to the actual modal average, or you're looking at, well, they just need to wait until their parents die off for them to get an inheritance, for them to even have any hope of starting a life by themselves, which again isn't in any way helpful or constructive. You know, someone whose parents are, say, 30 years older than them, you know, so they hit their 30s and their parents are in their 60s. Well, great. So that means that their parents have retired, but then the average kind of life expectancy worldwide is 79 years old. So that's another 20 years, give or take. And especially in places like the US and the UK, there's at least a level of reasonable healthcare there. In the States, the healthcare will drain the access to funds that any inheritance may actually have. In the UK, that might not be as prevalent, but it's still a case of those people are going to have to, those parents are going to have to live off those funds potentially up to 100 years old. And so it's a case of going, right, so that's still, another 40 years? So by the time that child who may not even have been able to rent successfully, depending on what they're doing, how they are doing it, that person may still through, even if they're being a productive member of society, they're doing a job full-time or more than full-time and all the rest of it, they still might not be earning enough money due to whatever it is that's got in their way early on in life, be it level of education, be it the specifics of what they've qualified in. You know, the number of people I know with PhDs who are still doing jobs that are outside of the realm of what they actually qualified to do, and usually to an extent that they are paid much, much less. You know, it's a case of you're still having those people wait for a long time before they can potentially get their lives started, and it might be as their lives are ending that they have access to resources to have their lives start under the current situation. And so, yeah, do I feel like the view of Doughnut economics on this as a way to visualize and a way to get it across to people that things need to change, could that solve the problem? I mean, it could, but then again, this could have been actioned 10 years ago. I've seen information on this kind of thing for a long while, and yet it's probably not going to make a dent for still, even now, a considerable period of time. But again, as per the point of the whole thing, the more people that want a thing, the more likely it is to happen. This is why voting is important. This is why public demonstration is important, as long as it's peaceful, and so on and so forth. But again, it needs to be working within the system to change the system, and that's the part that people are missing when it comes to applying themselves to the problem, because there are a small number of people at the top who are holding things the way that they are, and then you've got a lot of people down the bottom who want things to change, but they're either not engaging with it, they feel hopeless, and so they're not moving to go and achieve anything. Or the thing that I see a fair amount of, which is kind of depressing, is that they want it to happen, and they want it to happen so much and so fast that they just attack, and they get easily offended by everything. There's no tolerance, there's no patience, there's no tactful or strategic thought that's gone into it. They don't want the current system, they don't want to deal with it, they just want it solved, and that's unrealistic, it's never going to happen, and the best way to achieve change is gradual evolution, not sudden revolution. And as a result, it's one of those things that we're seeing at the moment, where all of the fighting is happening on the extremes, where you've got two extremes that want what they want, and they want it now. And as a result, neither of them are really getting anything, and everyone in the middle is suffering because of the further problems being caused. But anyway, guys, I'd love to hear your thoughts. I've gone on a little bit of a tangent on that back end, but it's a way to exemplify the point, how all of this cascades into other things. And you know, I'd love to hear your thoughts. I know that most of you guys are between like 18 and 30. And so it's a case of there's an awful lot here that affects us, and it's us working with these systems, working with these ideas, these models. We're going to eventually be the people who have to run the world with this, but also we want to actually live before that, right? You know, we want to be able to branch out and do what we want to do, and so that's why getting involved and paying attention to these ideas and working with them is so important. But anyway, guys, as said, I'd love to hear your thoughts, and otherwise I will see you in the video later. Take care. Thank you very much for watching, guys. If you enjoyed this video or found it interesting, please drop us a like, share this video, and subscribe for more, and I'll see you in the video later. Take care.